In this final lecture, I want to consider the church's responsibility to the poor and the needy. We talked about this some on a more individual basis when we were looking at giving, but this responsibility applies to the church as well as to individual Christians. Throughout the Bible, caring for the poor and needy is emphasized. And a major passage which deals with this is 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 through 16. Let me just begin by reading 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 through 8, and then we'll comment a little later on some of the other verses. Beginning at verse 3, honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God, and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead, even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, in the context of this passage, to honor widows refers not just to bowing down or saying how much we value you. No, it refers to providing material support for needy widows. Now, and the widows were the most vulnerable and dependent people in ancient society, because generally, back then, most women didn't have an education. They were totally dependent upon their husbands, and they weren't able to work outside the home. And there were no government programs or welfare programs or Social Security or any of the things that we have today in modern society. So you need to understand, when Paul here is talking about taking care of widows, widows are simply an example of needy people. So for example, if some old man or needy man came to the church and said, can you assist me? I mean, you couldn't point to this and say, no, I'm sorry, get out of here. Paul only says we have to take care of widows. Or if some married woman with children came asking assistance, you couldn't say, or you shouldn't say, get out of here. Paul is only saying take care of widows and you're married. No, his use of widows is simply an example, because he was looking at the most vulnerable people in society. And we know that. I mean, look at all kinds of other verses in the Bible. We quoted earlier from Ephesians 4, verse 28, where Paul said that if you had used to steal, then stop it. But instead, he says, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need. And it was not limited to widows. It was basically to anybody who has a need, all right? So Paul is just using an example. We saw when we quoted in an earlier lecture, James 1, verse 27, the essence of true religion is taking care of widows and orphans and remaining unstained from the world. Why? Because widows and orphans are the most vulnerable people, particularly in ancient society. Even in the context of this passage, we know that it's not limited to widows, because in verse 4, it says, if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety with regard to their own family and make some return to their parents. So it's not limited to the mother, but it's talking about the parents. We see that the church has an obligation to help needy people. Now, particularly in our congregations, but also not in the congregations. And so from this passage, first let me just say, I see two primary principles emerge. First, consider the person's need. Is the person truly needy, or does the person have other means of support? Now, that principle emerges from, again, verse 4. Because Paul recognizes that not many churches are small, your resources are limited. And so what he was saying in verse 4 was, if any widow has children or grandchildren, the children or grandchildren, must first learn to practice piety with regard to their own family and make some return to their parents. And then in verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So you see, back in that, so the issue is that Paul is talking about, does this person have any other means of support? Now, in his day, there was not Social Security. There were not corporate pensions because they didn't have corporations. There might not have been an inheritance. I mean, many women didn't inherit. It was the firstborn son inherited. So a lot of people, they didn't have inheritance. They didn't have pensions. There was not Social Security. There were not government welfare programs. They might not be able to work another job. So what Paul is saying basically, when we translate this into our context today, if someone comes to the church, you need to find out, do you have other means of support? Because, I mean, if you're small, you want to help them, but find that out. Maybe they're collecting a pension, maybe they're eligible for various government benefits or things like that. But, so you should look into that. You should know, by the way, as a church leader, are there NGOs or government agencies or other charitable organizations in your area that might be able to help people? Because if you're not able to help them yourself, you can direct them. You need to go here. And that's why I mentioned in a prior lecture, in this one town, there were these two churches. One was known as a teaching center, and one had a good helps ministry for needy people. And so if a poor person or a person in need came to my church, and I was from the teaching church, and we couldn't help that person ourselves, we'd send them over to the other church, you see. That's why you need to establish good relationships with other churches. And again, you send them there, you're doing the work of Christ. They might end up becoming a member of that church or whatever, but that's okay because they've come into the body of Christ. So you need to find out what is the real need here. And then the other consideration is the person's attitude. We get that from verse 6, but she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. You need to be careful here, because some people may come to the church and just say, this is your job, you have to help me. Well, not necessarily. But when it says, here's another caution here. If she just gives herself to wanton pleasure, she's dead even while she lives. Suppose a prostitute comes to your church seeking help. You look at the kind of life she's lived, or she's a drug addict, or whatever she is, has led a terrible life. You be very careful before you say, get out of here, change your life first. No. Jesus didn't say that to you. Jesus saved you. He didn't say, clean up your act and then I will save you. No, he saves us where we are, but he doesn't leave us where we are. And it may well be that prostitute or that drug addict says, has gotten to the point where he or she says, look at what my life has brought me. I don't know anything. I'm poor. I have no money. I'm in a physical wreck. And I don't know anything about Jesus, but I do know churches help people. This church, your church, may be that person's last hope. So help them, and then lead them to a better life. That's the thing. Because the church should be able to provide. I mean, some people just want money, but you know, more people would rather become self-sustaining rather than just the recipient of handouts. And so you need to develop a program for your own people and maybe people who come to you uh, to help them on the road to becoming self-sustaining. For example, uh, prostitute or something doesn't, all she knows how to be is a prostitute. I was in India many years ago, and I worked with a very good guy in ministry there. What he did, he got a building, got some sewing machines, and started teaching former prostitutes to be seamstresses. They could live there, so they had a safe place to live. They could now start making their own living, their own money in a legitimate way. That is the kind of thing you want to be able to do. I know one church in Western Kenya that gives microloans to people to help them start business. They have agreed upon projects. The people have to report back and pay back the loans. You can offer employment to needy persons. I mean, for example, a person comes asking for a handout or food or something, and you might say, listen, I'm glad you came here because we'd love to help you, but there's something you can do for us. We need, this church building needs to be swept out. The church compound, the grounds need to be cleaned. If you do that, we will pay you for it. And you might be able to establish a regular basis whereby the person comes every week or every 3 days or whatever it is. And now you're, helping that person on the road to self-sustainability. I mean, we talked in an earlier lecture about how in the ancient temple it actually included a storehouse. Well, the church could be kind of like a storehouse whereby you kept clothing, non-perishable food, and other needed items which you could provide to people in need. You see, and your church should know which members of your congregation could provide food, clothing, or other things. Now, let me give you an example of creative ways that different churches help people. One PAG church in Uganda had 43 widows. This was after a war, and but instead of giving them money, it bought them goats. Now, after 2 years, the 43 goats had multiplied and become 281 goats. The widows were able to sustain themselves. They had milk. They could sell the goats for money, could sell the milk. Some of the widows bought cows as a result of trading and selling the goats. And as a result, those widows were drawn closer to the church, and many became faithful prayer warriors and faithful givers after they got up on their feet. Again, your church should know what resources are available in your community through the government, through other charitable institutions, and so on and so forth. And, also your denominations may have aspects or agencies of benevolence. The Anglican Church has the Mothers Union. The PAG in Uganda has the PAG Planning and Development Secretariat. Different churches and churches of different denominations should work together to help people of need in their area because, if you're in a village or in a community, all the churches in the area, you face the same problems of poverty, of people needing jobs, of orphans, of HIV/AIDS, of refugees. And as I said in an earlier lecture, that may be too much for your little church to deal with by itself, but when you get together with other churches, you can provide lots of help. And you've got some people in your church, maybe one or two, whose heart goes out to orphans. Now, in that church, they've got one or two people whose heart goes out to orphans. And same in there. If you establish relationships with the leaders of the church and you know your people, you can get your people, those people, those people together. They can start a ministry to orphans. And they can be supported by your church, and that church. You see, That's how the work of God gets done, and that's how the gospel will spread. So even though your church may be small and poor itself, working with others will be you'll be able to do more than you could imagine, and you'll avoid duplication of cost and effort. And so, I mean, this is vital, particularly when people convert from Islam. As I mentioned, I think in an earlier lecture, somebody converts from Islam and they might be kicked out of their family, their life might be threatened, they might be fired from their job. That's where you need to work together with other churches to be able to provide food, clothing, safe shelter, money, education, and employment to such Islamic converts. If we do that, we will, demonstrate the love and power of Christ. And if we don't, we demonstrate that unlike the Muslims who provide these things to their converts, our faith is dead. Now, back in 1 Timothy 5, in verse 9, it said, a widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, if she's brought up her children, if she's shown hospitality to strangers, washed the saints' feet, and assisted those in distress, and has devoted herself to every good work. Now, the list, there's some dispute among the scholars as to the list, but most people think the list referred to those widows that the church agreed to support for the rest of her life. But you need to understand something. The age 60 requirement is not a law that applies universally. And the reason is you got to understand the historical and cultural context. 60 was the recognized age in the ancient world when a person was considered old. But I've seen a study that in the first century, fewer than 4% of women lived even to age 50. So if somebody was 60, that means they were probably not going to live very long. They were the most marginalized people. Today, things are very different, at least in most Western countries, and actually I think in most of the countries of East Africa. 60 is not considered old. As I say this, I and my wife are both 68, and because we changed our diet many years ago and we lost weight, we're much healthier, and if you called my wife who's 68 old, she would be highly offended. So culturally, if Paul were writing this today, he might not say, don't put a widow on the list unless she's at least 80. But it depends upon the circumstances. You got to take a look at the person. Now, some scholars think that the list refers to enrolling the widows in some official ministry in the church in exchange for their being supported by the church. Something that was known as the Order of Widows developed in the early church based upon this passage. And basically, those widows were involved in charitable service to others and in teaching younger people. And again, the fact is, even the very old want to be helpful. They can be prayer warriors, like those 43 widows in that PAG church in Uganda. Many of them became prayer warriors for the church. Now, older people, remember this, they have a wealth of experience and wisdom that can and should be put to use, particularly, if you're going to be supporting them. And that's where I mentioned a prostitute comes to the church asking for help. If you help her, and you do more than just give money, do like my friend in India did. If you can, get her on the road to a new life. Talk with her about Jesus, but then just don't leave it. Okay, you've accepted Jesus into your heart, now you're saved, go away. No, 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 no. That person needs help, material help, as well as spiritual help. But think about it. People like that, they've gone through, or drug addicts, they get clean. They have a wealth of experience that can be of tremendous help. That prostitute could be a tremendous teacher for the young women in your church to show her, don't do what I did. This is what it leads to. And it's only by the grace of God that I've been saved and delivered from that life. So again, use your imagination and use your creativity. Helping people is not just about giving them money, but is trying to assess their situation well and get them on the road to self-sustainability. So know the resources in your denomination, the resources among other churches, the resources of the government, and so on, and you will accomplish much. Let me conclude this lecture by saying this, that you will see, I think, tremendous results when your church meets its responsibility for caring for the poor and the needy, because God will be pleased, because caring for the poor and needy is part of the essence of true religion, as we saw from James 1 verse 27 and other passages. God will take care of us as a church materially if we put him first and are faithful. But when we take care of the poor and the needy, as we saw on the lecture on New Covenant giving, first, we will not experience the shame that will result from failing to meet our responsibility. And in that regard, Muslims are very attuned to this. They very frequently say, if you need help, come to the mosque. They open schools, and they say to Christian parents, send your child to our school. You won't have to pay tuition, because they're using those things to get them to convert to Islam. So we need to take care of people so that they don't fall into the clutches of the Muslims. As we saw in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, when we take care of the poor and needy, not only individually, but now corporately as a church, this will result in thanksgiving and praise to God, and the glory of God will be manifested. God will impart his special grace and joy to us, the givers, and we will see the fruits of this as we see changed lives. And taking care of the poor and the needy will build up the church, because it will support the poor and the needy saints physically and spiritually, because it's not just taking care of strangers. We need to know our own people, and that's important. If you're a church leader, you need to know your people well. You need to know those who have needs, because everybody has certain needs. But if you know your people, so you'll know that your people are also resources. So you might have one person over here who needs a job, but you also know that I have these 2 or 3 business people in my church who can give him a job. So you talk to them about giving this guy a job. I know a pastor in central Kenya, small town, small city in central Kenya. He has a good reputation in his area. And what he's done is he's gotten to know the owners of petrol stations, the owners of restaurants, the owners of hotels, and they know him. And so if some person comes into his congregation and needs a job, he can talk with that person and call up the owner of the petrol station or the hotel or the restaurant and say, I've got this person here who needs a job. Are you able to hire him? And he has been able to place any number of people because those business owners know him. But I'm sure he tells the person, listen, you're getting a job because that business owner knows me. So you need to understand, you need to be the best employee he has. Show up to work on time, all the time. Be a good worker, because my name is on the line here, not just yours. And that's what you need to do. You need to know your own people well. You need to know your communities well, know the resources that are available, and then you'll be able to support the people who come to your church in creative and good and self-sustaining ways. And this will enable the people, the saints, and the others to help each other. They can help themselves now, and then they will have the resources to help others. And finally, as we saw in 2 Corinthians 9, this will help knit the church together. And you see, you can give testimonies. Have the person who was helped be able to give a testimony and say, I was at the end of my rope, but I came here, and you have been able to do this for me. You gave me this micro loan. You gave me a job. You referred me here to get a job. I am so grateful. The entire congregation is going to be knit together because of this, because they see the gospel being acted out. That is why it is so vital when I talked about mission, that people need to see that the gospel is more than just singing and dancing on Sundays and getting dressed up. That's minor. The things that please God is seeing the gospel going out, making disciples, changing lives. And that's why kind of the motto for Equipping Church Leaders East Africa is deep foundations first. In other words, teaching the Word of God in all of its aspects deeply, because that leads to healthy churches. That's what we need. Healthy churches are those that disciple their people, that are engaged in mission, that show unity and wholeness, and that increases worship. So deep foundations, healthy churches, and that leads to transformed lives. And transformed lives are not just individual lives, but those transformed people then go out to start transforming the life of their village or community. That's what Christianity is all about. That's what the gospel is all about. And as I conclude this final lecture, I want to conclude simply by saying, as we have seen, the Bible and the gospel apply to all areas of life. We are stewards over everything that God has given us, and we are accountable for everything that God has given us. And that goes from the environment we live in, because God owns it. It's his footstool, to our minds, our time, our bodies, our relationships, our money and possessions, and the church. And if we start meditating on this, seeing these things, thinking of the implications, and then using the mind that Christ has given us to apply these things in our lives, as I said at the end of an earlier lecture, your church is going to be transformed, and you are going to be God's instrument for transforming not only the lives of your people, but the community, the communal life, the quality of life of your village and your community. And you're going to look back and you're going to see how God is now, because you're taking his word seriously, he is going to start leading you in ways that he has never led you before, because now you're serious about him, about the gospel, about the word of God. And as you start applying it, you're going to see, Jesus, you are alive. You are doing things I never dreamed or imagined, and I never knew it could be this good. God bless you.